So, selling to the oil and gas industry using podcasts. Let me share what we've learned. The first thing is, why a podcast? Many reasons podcasts make a great tool to help increase your sales. Number one is the cost of entry is very low. Number two is most of the industry are now podcast listeners. So in the old days, you would have to spend a lot of money on a print magazine or TV or radio ads and try to get in front of a few people that work in oil and gas. Now with a podcast, you can get in front of tens of thousands, if not more, people that work in the industry for, like I said, very little money. It's really interesting. Podcast listenership in the oil and gas industry is up 72% from 2019. Most people that work in oil and gas listen to an average of 7 podcasts a week. That's a lot of mind share to get your company in front of these people. The next thing is podcasts are hyper targeted. If you have a podcast around health, safety, and environmental, that's a super great audience to talk to about FRs, any type of PPE, gloves, right? Because that podcast audience are people that are interested in health, safety, and environment, it's naturally a good fit for the companies that are trying to sell anything to do with safety or the environment or health, right? So podcasts being hyper targeted makes it really easy when trying to sell to the oil and gas industry using podcasts. Then, a podcast basically is education through storytelling. Nobody likes to be pitched. Nobody wants to feel like they're trying to be forced to buy something they don't want. But the podcast world is different. In most cases, for really good podcasts, they're not trying to pitch a product or service at all. What they're really doing is educating by telling a story. That's a different approach to sales in oil and gas. So if you tell the story about how your downhole tool improves production or increases safety metrics or is cheaper or is quicker to get on the job site, that story naturally will arouse people's curiosities, and if they have a need for what you do, they're going to reach out to you. So that storytelling while you're doing education is a more gentle but more real way to get your product or your service in front of people and educate them how you can help them. And then, like I said earlier, podcasting is super cost effective. Probably for the price of one booth at a major trade conference in oil and gas, you could fund a year's worth of podcasting. That one booth at that trade conferences is going to get the attention of whatever sales and marketing people walk by that day or two, whereas a podcast is going to have the attention of people every week for the entire year. Total different scale, and like I said, much more cost effective than almost any other type of marketing or advertising out there. And then accessibility, right? So you can listen to a podcast while you do other things. That's actually one of the key drivers of why they're so successful. You can listen to a podcast while you're commuting, while you're working out, washing dishes. You can't do that with video, right? You can't do that with print. You can't do that with trade shows. And so what happens is your audience listens to you at their convenience. They're relaxed. They look forward to episodes. So it's a way to get mind share with your potential buyers in a way that doesn't feel so salesy. And it's super accessible. Anywhere in the world, people can listen to your shows on a multiple of platforms. It doesn't require a lot of bandwidth. So it's a very easy way to digest what how you're talking about your company and your product or your service. Now, in the grand scheme of things, podcasts are relatively new in the oil and gas industry, but we've been doing it probably longer than anybody else. And we've seen a lot of successes, not just ours, but other podcasters out there. So some things to think about. Is your product or service easy to explain? If it's more complex, podcasts are excellent for that because you can take the time to explain the complexities. You can even do multiple parts so that you're educating in steps so people can build upon a base of knowledge. If you're a company that the oil and gas industry doesn't know, or maybe you're in a part of the world, right? That happens a lot where companies are very popular in the Middle East or in South America or in Europe, but the oil and gas industry in the US doesn't know who they are, or vice versa. It's a great way to build organic brand awareness just by telling the stories of your company and how you help your customers, and hopefully telling the stories from your customers' point of view. You can now educate the industry about who you are, what you do, how you can help them. And like I said, it's relatively new in oil and gas, but podcasting has been used commercially for the last 20 years, and the oil and gas industry is rapidly catching up. From a implementation point of view, a couple of things. We believe you should use a third party, and the reason we believe you should use a third party is that if you launch your own podcast, which is not that hard to do, but then it sounds like your company marketing department is trying to sell or pitch your product. Well, when you have a third independent party actually do your podcast, number one, it's much easier for you, but number two, you have that third party air around the podcast so people don't believe that you're trying to sell or market something. And then the other thing is people usually just discount an in-house podcast. Now, with all that said, if you want to do your in-house podcast to help sell your products or service to oil and gas industry, go for it. Like I said, it's very inexpensive. The worst that could happen is you waste a couple $100 and you don't increase any sales. And then you learn your lesson and you go find a third party. The other thing about using a third party is they typically have an existing audience, so you get to tap into the existing audiences they have instead of trying to build your own, which takes time. Then most podcasting communities or organizations out there like OGGN have this large community. By you actually working within that community, you can get in front of the people that you want to right now, not 6 or 8 months or a year from now if you did it yourself. And then most oil and gas companies, or most companies that are trying to sell to oil and gas, podcasting is not your core business. So if you're selling to oil and gas industry using podcasts, really think about using a third party. If you decide to go down the third party route, a couple of things. First, check out their reach, both geographically and number of downloads. Ask them to literally log into their hosting provider and show you in real time the actual numbers. But numbers are not everything. So here's what one of our shows look like. Blueberry, go ahead and log in. And we'll look at oil and gas this week, and we'll look at all the statistics. And you can see that this show has over 1.4 million listeners. We had 517 people listen today, a little over 38,000 people listen in the last 30 days. And then when you look at our distribution geographically, if we go to view all countries, you can see that we're in 198 different countries, and our biggest listeners are where you would expect: United States, Canada, United Kingdom, so on and so on. So this is what a podcast dashboard should look like, and this is what your provider should easily be able to show you. Next, ask for sponsor referrals. Just talk to their sponsors and very upfront say, have they driven good results for you? You'll quickly realize if these shows somebody that you want to work with or not. Then, is their product focused on your niche? Is their podcast audience the people that you want to get in front of? And then, are they professional podcasters? There's a big difference between people that do it as an amateur podcast, which means they don't get paid for it, and the people that do it professionally, which are the ones that do get paid for it. The difference is everything from education, experience, and the ability to tell your customer story in a way that makes sense. Then, are they considered part of the media? Any podcasting organization out there in the oil and gas industry should be considered part of the media. If they are, that's another checkbox for you. Then, when you get into contract negotiations, what is your gut feel? Are they quickly trying to close a deal, or are they more interested in helping you solve a problem? How much time do they talk about how they can help you and how they've done it with others versus contract terms? Then, how are their contracts written? Are their contracts written to guarantee them more revenue or to minimize risk for you? And I'm telling you right now, they should be written to minimize risk for you. And then finally, do they have an onboarding process for sponsors, for new sponsors? So when you come on board for the podcast, do they have a process in place that they've worked with other sponsors before that drives success? Now, if you want to do your own podcast, it's actually really inexpensive. You don't need a $1,000 microphone. We use $80 Audio-Technica microphones. You don't need a lot of sound equipment. You don't need a mixing board. A digital recorder like a Zoom is just fine. You need some cables. You need a quiet place to record. You then need a hosting provider like Blueberry, Libsyn, and then an iTunes account, right? So it's really that simple to stand up your own podcast. But once again, from a commercially successful point of view, from wanting to help sell your product or service to the oil and gas industry, we highly recommend a third party. So hopefully it's helped explain a little bit how you can use a podcast to sell to the oil and gas industry. It's a wonderful way, and there's so many other side benefits besides sales, but you absolutely can drive new revenue with the podcast. I hope that helped. We will see you next time.